volunteers.
My name is Carla Storm, and I'm with Secaucus Healthy Families, which is a small Chippewa tribe mole lake near Crandon, Wisconsin. And I am enjoying this because most of my other trainings are just put on by the state. So coming to a Native American training is absolutely beautiful. I loved everything I learned yesterday, but for me, we are taught, I'm a home visitor, so we go into a lot of trauma-based informed homes or based homes, and self-care is preached and preached and preached. But I think I learned more just from yesterday about self-care than I have every other training that I've been to. So I am grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Other folks?
Hello, my name is Brooke. I'm a student here, and I'm currently working as a youth addictions counselor. One big takeaway that I had from yesterday was that a lot of the interventions that we learned about are really cost-effective and pretty easy to implement. They seem like very effective practices as well.
Brooke is a student in my indirect practice class where we spent a semester talking about budgets, so I'm glad you were able to think about that. These are very easy to implement strategies for both self-care and for encouraging care among clients. Other folks?
Good morning. I'm Grace Shalier, a faculty member here in the Center for Native American Studies. I was really glad to hear Dr. Yellowbird yesterday talk about mindfulness from an indigenous perspective, because I don't think many people know about that from an indigenous perspective, mindfulness is quite different than what it is from a dominant culture perspective. So that was very interesting to me.
Hi, I'm Candace. I work down in Munising. I'm a mental health and substance use therapist. TJ, what's up? What I took away from yesterday is it's definitely going to affect how the questions I asked during my clinical assessment, asking more about movement, sleep. I love the singing and dancing. So that's definitely going to affect my everyday practice now. Thank you.
I'm Amanda Frazier. I work as a prevention specialist for Sioux Tribe. For me, I've been doing intermittent fasting for about a year now, and I have noticed a big difference in just how I feel every day and my energy levels. So it was nice kind of learning more of that. I did it because I was having some health issues, and I feel like it has really helped me. So.
Bonjour, my name is TJ. So I work with Native population around Marquette, and I think the main thing that I kind of struggle with is, in growing up in kind of this dominant culture society thing, a lot of the decolonizing strategies and things that we are learning about, I struggle with it because initially when I hear things like mindfulness and intermittent fasting, I'm like, man, that's just some hippy dippy stuff, But I also know that is that's that dominant culture just telling me, messing with my brain too, just saying, no, just take your pills, you're good, it's that consumerism that's been, shoved down my throat forever, and no, just maintain status quo. Anything outside of the norm is bad, any of your traditional teachings are bad, they're not evidence-based, they're not proven, and you need all this, you need I need NPR to tell me, like, finally, it's okay to do fasting, you know. And I'm pretty progressive, you know. I'm pretty liberal, and I still struggle with that kind of stuff, with those kind of accepting even my own traditional beliefs and practices and things like that. And so if it's difficult for me to accept some of this stuff, like, my clients are going to be even more resistant, I think, to some of these things. So so I'm looking forward to learning more about strategies that I can use to encourage my clients to you know, to do a bit of more of the, you know, Minimum type lifestyle, you know, and just how I can incorporate those into their treatment plans or their service plans or their ways of thinking. So, but I really appreciate everybody here and the teachings that we're getting.
Anyone else? I'll be very pleased if we get full participation.
I'm Janice Halverson. I'm a survivor advocate in a women's center on my res. And usually I don't say anything, but I was really moved yesterday by Dr. Yellowbird's, is that his name? Speech and teaching. Because I've decided recently to make a healthy lifestyle change. At one time, believe it or not, I was very athletic and I was a runner. And I want to teach that to my grandchildren, my children, and I work with a lot of women who have a traumatic history, and a lot of us on the reservation do, and a lot of us have family members as well, and drug addiction, and prescription drugs, and worse. And if we could start teaching our own, and I'll just take my own grandchildren by the hand and take a walk in the woods. I know for me it'll be baby steps, but it was very encouraging, very confirming. Rather than throwing drugs, to think that, to put all that together, it seems so simple once you hear it and see it on a screen and someone tells you that everything you were used to doing when you were younger actually was beneficial to your mind and your spirit and your body. I think that sums it up, and thank you.
Okay. Thank you all. It's really important to be able to hear what you all are gaining and to, again, sort of learn from each other and understand the multiple perspectives that are in the room and the different kinds of learning that is happening. I asked April to also spend a little bit of time sharing what brings her here, like I did yesterday, because that's probably a little bit of a different perspective.
Yeah, Miigwech. So a couple of summers ago, I saw this link to a grant. And sometimes you kind of cross your fingers with these things like, oh, that sounds really cool. Maybe I should try it. But this particular title of the grant pretty much seemed like it was a billboard sign to me that said, if you don't go for this, you're just dumb. So I forwarded it on to Abigail, and we only had a couple weeks, right? I mean, the dude, I wasn't catching it on the first release, right? We only had a couple weeks, and it was about how to bring more opportunities and possibilities for exploration and expanding what we do in giving care to victims in rural reservation communities. Wow, we live in a rural area. We have social work and Native studies on our campus. And so we went for it. And I feel like when sometimes Grace uses the word serendipity all the time. This was one of the most serendipitous projects that literally fell into my email box in my lap. But at the same time, I don't want people to think that that was the only spark that made me reach out to social work, because even before Abigail, her predecessor, Tim Hilton, I had been chasing him down we need to be working together. We need to be working together. We need to be working, looking at our curriculum. We need to, and I'm grateful that this opportunity came to us because it allowed us the time and attention that we needed to do it in a good way, right? Where other times you're just chasing things, right? You're reacting and you're chasing things. So this allowed us the time and resources to try to approach things in a good way. So for me being here and my why, it's because it's all about healing. I am firmly convinced, and I talk about this in my presentation, I am firmly convinced Native Studies as a discipline has the power to heal within a system that has previously been complicit in oppressing. And being able to work with other disciplines to bring that to the communities maybe it's not somebody in my classroom, but maybe it is somebody that needs information in the community. We know people need this information and this care, this type of care in the community. Whether it be, because I'm sure we have a lot of different representation here of who serves what, but I think about the volunteering that I did with Great Lakes Recovery's Youth House. The young people over there had distinct needs, and the American Indian youth over there had even more distinct needs. And they knew that if there was an American Indian female, I would volunteer sometimes to spend time with that person, just to hang out with them, nothing more. I wasn't doing anything more than maybe taking them to the movies. But they needed time and needed somebody to understand them on their level, right? And that's what we're not necessarily afforded in our society today. TJ, I think you mentioned something about getting forced to, having to take this, that, and the other thing. We're actually succumbing to a lot of things other than just taking pills, right? And I'm going to talk about what are we succumbing to with visual representation, because that in and of itself is another way that we're forced to take in things. And with all of our senses and the details that Dr. Yellowbird shared yesterday with our senses, the visual is more powerful than all the other senses combined, so say the artists of the world, right? The visual is really powerful sense. And so I'm going to be talking about that later today. And I, again, just can't express my appreciativeness enough that you guys are all here and joining with us in this journey today. So with that, I'm not going to take this microphone any longer this morning, so we want to get back into the training with Dr. Yellowbird. He's going to continue on from where he was left off yesterday. And so and can I just say I'm really grateful that so many of you felt that yesterday's afternoon went so well. So with that, miigwech, and I will invite Dr. Yellowbird to come on up and get rolling. And as he's getting ready, if anybody needs Sweetwater, any drinks, feel free to go ahead and move about. We do have Decolonizing Diet Project bread up here, pumpkin maple blueberry bread. So feel free to enjoy some of that as well as we're transitioning with our first keynote.
Can I get into the internet real quick here, just while everyone's taking a break? Oh. Yeah. Just wanted to get my Facebook page up so I could see how many likes I got. No, I'm kidding. Something I was going to show. So it's right there. So. Let's see, I wonder if I can get in through this way. Okay, I don't remember what my password is. Is there any way you can get into, do you have a Facebook?
I do.
Can you get in there? Then I want to see if I can find mine. I just want to look at one of my posts here that I think. Changed my darn password so many times because it gets hacked, try to carry it in my wallet, but I just put my name down. Yeah, okay. Good morning, folks. Maybe, is there a way to kind of dim these front lights again so just get a little better screen for folks? So I just wanted to share something this morning, ceremony, because, you know, everything we've been doing has some part of ceremony attached to it. You know, when we think about ceremony, we think about formal kinds of actions we take, you know, that have some kind of traditional, purpose, you know. And we perform those, for different kinds of reasons, social, religious, spiritual reasons, and on different occasions. And, we have these prescriptions for our life every day and protocols. And I wanted to just share something from my Facebook page here that I posted about running. I talked about it yesterday. Well, running, this is an interesting article, if you're interested, the importance of running in Native American culture. And it's about women running. You can see I was in Canada when I posted this, April 13th. But we evolved to run. Running, walking, and dancing are traditional. They are important markers in our DNA. Running is sacred. It's about persistence. It's protest, it's activism, and it's healthy. The benefits of running are even greater when we avoid the standard American diet and eat a healthy ancestral foods. Get a sufficient amount of fiber and regularly run in a fasted state, just like our ancestors did. Indigenous women, and this is what this article is about, are leading the way. Running can heal. Prayer can heal. Praying while you run can heal. And this is kind of, someone mentioned that earlier, that this is what we do. It's a very traditional practice. So it's not like you're out there running. When you think about Indigenous people and today about Western running, very, very different endpoints and beginning points. Running for Indigenous people was about survival, was about healing, was about prayer. Today, Western running is about breaking records and who's first and who's sponsored by Nike and those kinds of things. So think about that. If you decolonize your running and thinking about running, it's very different, from an Indigenous perspective. So I wanted to start out here. Let me go back to where I was. Oh, I want to show you guys this too. This is from Easter. It's these Indians here. Shot the Easter bunny. And then I have different things I post about genetics and meditation and stuff, and a lot of things. This is another article. It's called "This Is Your Brain on Friends." So if you look me up, a lot of times I just post articles on how important friendships are and support are. That's collectivism. And what happens to the brain. Fasting. I talked about this yesterday, about the 72 hours. This is a scientific article on from MIT. Fasting boosts stem cell regenerative capacities. So, a lot of food stuff. Not too many selfies. This is my students here practicing mindfulness at one of my classes. This is the article yesterday about Sanjay Gupta. Again, I did this presentation at Blue Quills. And this is a res dog up on at Cree First Nations when I was up there in Ontario. There he is again by the gas station. Things that I read, I'm always reading about mindfulness in different contexts, and this is about prisoners. I used to do a lot of work with incarcerated Native men in the prisons. One of the most forgotten populations of us are Native men who are incarcerated, and women. There's a lot of them. I had the good fortune of, for myself personally, living when I lived in Kansas at Lawrence, Kansas. I was a professor at the University of Kansas, and Leavenworth was just right up the way, and I used to go, I know Leonard Peltier, so I used to visit with him quite a bit, and then all the young Native men that were in there, and I talked to them about, the Dharma or practicing mindfulness while in prison. So my house is for sale, so it's almost sold now. But I wanted to post this last one here of this meditation here. When our mind remains free from the pressures of external situations and emotions, it becomes more peaceful, wise, open, and spacious. A mind at peace with itself protects the body's health, and it's the healing power of the mind. So everything I've talked about, whether you're hungry and you're fasting, whether you're sitting in a sweat lodge or a sauna, whether you're running, you're dancing, you're beating, whatever you're doing, that's a time that you free yourself from external distractions and situations, and your mind becomes peaceful. So it's all mindfulness. It's all a meditation. It's all traditional in that way. And when your mind is at that state of peacefulness, all the research shows that, we heal. Inflammatory processes go down. Good neurochemicals like dopamine, feel-good chemicals, serotonin go up. Norepinephrine levels of alertness go up, and so on. I'll talk about some of that. But I just wanted to share some of these that I had. So I want to start here this morning. So that's my cup I bought, and I really do mean that. It's humor, but it's really also a way of thinking about how do we begin to liberate our minds, and we have to come back to this point to stay in the present moment often, because our mind is being competed for by many different forces, external forces, right? If you're not beating or running, and because a lot of times people run and say, well, I run and I process my problems, and I tell people that's okay for the first mile or first 10 minutes into your run. After that, let that shit go, right? And just think about how it feels to have a body, how fortunate you are to be able to run or walk or move, right? And that's the mindfulness that goes along with it. I want to start this morning with a short meditation and do a couple of meditations throughout my presentation. So this first one I'm going to do is a very fundamental one. It's called breath awareness, and it's one that we start with a lot. So if you could put down your food and drink and everything and kind of bring yourself to a position of sitting up straight with your spine straight, your feet on the floor. Move your shoulders a couple times, and your neck, and shake out your fingers. And just begin now to do this ceremony, like it is. It's a action, right? To begin to free your mind from the distraction and focus your awareness on your breath. So if it feels safe, you can close your eyes. If not, you can gaze at something in front of you, your eyes half open. And I'm going to lead you through a short breath awareness meditation. So as you begin, check in with your body, check in with your spine, your neck, check in with your feet, your sit bones, your legs, just to see what kind of position you're in. And allow your hands to be relaxed on your lap or flat on your thighs or palms facing up, whatever feels comfortable for you. And just begin to become aware that you are breathing now. And don't change your breathing, but just pay attention to how it feels. And so watch your breath as it comes in, and watch it as it goes out, being aware. And you follow your breath from the point of its origin outside of your body. It's about 5 inches, 3 inches from your nose, where it begins. Goes into your nose, through your nostrils, down through your windpipe, into your lungs and into your diaphragm, filling you up. And then you pause and then allow it to go back out. All doing this at your own pace. And if you can just see the moment when your breath begins outside of you and it picks up and you bring it in, fills you. And the moment that it stops filling, and just for a moment pause and allow it then to begin to just flow out nice and easily. Breath is life. Life is about breath. Nothing more to do in this present moment except to pay attention to this calm breath that you're taking in, the calm breath that you're exhaling from your body. Sometimes thoughts come into your brain, you get distracted, that's okay. Thank those thoughts, acknowledge those thoughts, and go back to your anchor. Your anchor is always your breath. Your breath will liberate you, will heal you. Breathing in, nice, slow, even breath. Breathing out, a nice, slow, even breath. And for a moment, I want you just to continue breathing, but I want you to listen to all the sounds in the room, and what do you hear? Just pay attention. Don't strain, but just listen to the different sounds that are present in the room. So just continue breathing again, being aware of your breath as your breath comes in, filling you, breath goes out. And I'm going to count you down now from 5. And as I count, sometimes people get a little anxious or they tighten up. Just remember to keep your body in this state, feeling relaxed, enjoying the moment. Your mind has been free. 4. And when I reach 0, then I want you to slowly open your eyes, but hold your position. Just gaze, just for a moment. 3. 2. And when you open your eyes, I want you to visualize for the first time enlightenment, that you're an enlightened being. 1, 0. Slowly open your eyes. Maintain your gaze. Maintain a gaze. Slowly open your eyes. Okay, just hold it without moving for a while. And when you're ready, you can begin to move. And I want you to turn to the person next to you and talk about what that experience was like. How did that feel this morning? Some of you are long-term meditators already, so be interesting to hear what you have to say. But just turn to the people in your table and just talk about that for a minute. What was that like? Okay, so what was that like? Anybody want to volunteer? What was that like? How did it feel? Oh, you're all zen now, huh? Going zen on me, yeah. Can you guys hear? Can you guys hear? I worked in corrections for a number of years as a clinician, and I used to do the breathing exercises and this meditation with my groups. Sometimes at the beginning, sometimes depended on how things were going. If I felt like I was working too hard, then I would do this, and because groups should do the work. Anyway, different expressions and experiences from it, of course, and they don't expect something like this to happen to them, but they would wake up and literally many times they'd fall asleep during the meditation, and they'd wake up and they just feel like they were in a safe place, which is unusual for a correctional facility. It's if any of you have ever been inside one way or the other, you know that it's not a relaxed atmosphere. And but they'd wake up and they'd feel so good. And it made, like I said,
made me feel good to be able to share this with them. And the thing about people is we're all the same. Doesn't make a difference whether you're on one side of that fence or the other. You're still the same. Everybody's the same in many, many ways. And that's one thing I learned, especially working with the traditional way in correctional facilities. I did a little bit of that. Was fortunate to, and experienced the circle and the festivals we did. But it was, like I said, the meditation was very, very important, and it worked very well in the correctional facility.
Thank you. Very important. If you're interested in a very similar story, and I really strongly recommend it, there's a free video you can watch online. It's called Doing Time, Doing Vipassana. And Vipassana is a particular type of mindfulness meditation. And it's really, really interesting. It talks, the stories about incarcerated populations, very violent populations in India that are incarcerated. And a woman who becomes the warden of the prison introduces meditation practices to the prisoners who have major transformations. So that's Doing Time, Doing Vipassana. There's also another one about prisons called the Dharma Brothers. Dharma Brothers. Again, I think that's a free watch. You can watch on the internet, Dharma Brothers. Again, people that you would thought were incorrigible, that had the nightmares, that had the worst adverse childhood experiences. A number of African-American men, but other men, Hispanic men, and some white men in this particular movie who went through this transformation. And through a retreat, after these retreats, they had these amazing transformations, right? Safety issues, violence and those kinds of things. Anyone else? Comment? Yeah.
I'm Buddhist, and I've never heard our cultures compared like this. It's fascinating. This is what we sit. We don't meditate. We sit like this, and this is the same. It feels the same to me.
So, similarities, with the meditation, the practice, right? Who else? Anyone else? Okay, all right. My teacher, my Dharma teacher is Pete the Cat. So, I have to show you a video of Pete the Cat one of these times. Anyway, so we started, before we get more into like the mindfulness stuff and how mindfulness sort of, this part of the meditation stuff works, just in the formal sitting kind of stuff. I want to talk a little bit about, why for a lot of people it was important to develop a sense of, stability and equanimity, a feeling of safety and so on. And so when we talk about indigenous people, a lot of times there's been a lot of talk about historical trauma. And, our bodies do get colonized by trauma, as I said yesterday. Now we have enough information so that what we can do is we can look at different kinds of molecular structures that exist. And we know that, while you do mindfulness or meditation, it really varies for people. Because some people, have different kinds of trauma and have different kinds of genetic expressions and inheritance that make it very different. Something that we haven't really studied in terms of meditation. Even most people that write about it now are only studying some of the neurobiology, how the brain works. Most people aren't studying the molecular and cellular processes that exist in people with really deep trauma, right? A lot of indigenous people. This first slide, chronic stress, what I call enzymatic colonization, happens to people after repeated exposures to stress. And in this particular slide here, we're talking about, these are called dendritic spines. And if you can look at the dendritic spines during these early periods of as you're young, you have these spines that are grown. These spines here take up chemical messengers for movement, for memory, for learning, those kinds of things. So a healthy experience, you grow a lot of spines, you know, if you have different languages in your household and so on, or different kinds of adverse or you know, very diverse learning, you grow more spines. Adolescents, the red ones, they get pruned away, all this stuff naturally. And as you go down to early adulthood, these things are pruned away even more. And finally in adulthood, you know, some are still being pruned away, and you know, every now and then you may get a spine that grows even as an adult, where you start learning a new skill or whatever. Spines are very delicate. You know, they're very important. They're in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. What we know about these spines, though, they're so important to us, is their, you know, importance to sensory experience and learning. We know that, you know, sensory deprivation prevents development. You know, when you're not hugged enough and touched enough, when you're in a place where that's absent. And we talked just about, you know, people in prisons just now. 95% of those people in the prisons, you know, probably didn't have any positive touch growing up. So deficit in some of these spines here in the part of the brain, right? Here's what we know too. Chronic stress chemicals, right? After all this chronic stress, have this protein CNAS C that breaks down these delicate dendritic spines. Affects your learning, your memory, and so on, and it doesn't feel safe, right? And the spines are really, of course, associated with, you know, learning and memory, but beyond that even. We know there's a difference, too, between men and how they react to chronic, you know, stress and trauma. Men build a greater density when they're under chronic stress, right? Acute stress, I should say, in particular, which makes sense. Men are bigger, they have more muscle, they're more aggressive, and generally evolutionary science says they're the ones that are going to protect. So they have to have more, you know, memory and learning and movement and that kind of thing. Women, on the other hand, are affected differently. They lose more of these dendritic spines. So in some sense, they lose learning, they lose a little bit of memory and response, which makes sense, again, from an evolutionary point of view, because all they have to do is muster up the effort and the energy and the resources to protect the children, right? So this goes back to, again, a very long genetic or evolutionary kind of thing. But we know now today, chronic stress produces this CNAS C, this protein that damages, you know, our dendritic spines. So very powerful stress. Good news is that we know that they can be repaired when stress is eliminated. All the things I was talking about, you're taking hot, you know, saunas, sweats every day for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you know, increases your heat shock proteins, the protein misfolding I was talking about, increases, you know, the dendritic spines growth. If you run and you exercise, without the stress in your brain, because a lot of people run like, oh, I'm so stressed out. You have to let the stress go, right? If you're with people, company, right? All that sort of thing. So the different things I've talked about, all those different factors, dancing, singing, we know those things heal. Dendritic spines, too, if you have enough of them, of course, are one of these factors that help protect us against neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. So I'm giving you, you know, this is not, you know, it's cutting edge science, but this is not new information. We know that harmony and balance for us is so important because we don't see what's happening at the enzymatic or the molecular level. All we know is I'm stressed out as hell, but we don't know that we're damaging or something, what we're hanging on to, historical trauma or historical memories and stuff. We're not letting it go, or we're in a stressful situation that we're damaging ourselves at the molecular level. And again, I'm not blaming people or saying it's self-imposed. You know, sometimes, you know, we don't have the option, but I'm just telling you what's important about, you know, knowing about it. This is some research that's gone on to kind of show partly the epigenetic world that we live in. We know that mothers and daughters, mothers and children have a very close relationship, and they share a lot of the DNA as well as cellular talk and that kind of thing. I don't think I have this particular slide in there, but I'll tell you about that in just a second, another slide. But we know that, from research now, that mothers can pass on, vulnerability to depression. Same way that, they can pass on green eyes or curly hair, in this particular study, girls inherit a brain structure that's predisposed to mood disorders. And that's getting a lot of press and study right now with the epigenetic study. I don't have this slide in here that I'm talking about now, but one of the things we also know is that there is a really close shared cellular sort of, situation between mothers and children. Interesting research has gone on with women who have had gotten older and gotten Alzheimer's disease, who donated their brains to science. Women get Alzheimer's more than men do, right? Not sure why, but it's there. But one of the things that, folks who were studying the women's brains that were donated began to look at all the enzymes and all of the different kinds of proteins and amyloid, buildup and tau tangles that were in the brain. And one of the things that, was really interesting that they found after examining all of the different kinds of materials in these older women's brains that were like 80 years old or so, and even older, they found the cells of the babies that they had given birth to in their brains. And guess what? The cells were still alive decades after they had given birth. The cells were still communicating with mom's brain. It's interesting research. So science is kind of looking at thinking like, what's going on? What kind of cell talk? And so evolutionary biological people got in there with all these neuroscientists, and they, came up with a theory that it's evolutionary, that the baby's brain or cells migrate up into mom's brain, and they're talking to the brain, saying, feed me, hold me, take care of me, love me, those kinds of things, right? And it's an evolutionary survival mechanism. Then I took that research and I thought about it for a while, and I said, okay, this is partly related to what we call complicated grief now. Why sometimes, mothers, more than fathers, cannot get over the loss of a child. We think it's just an emotional thing, right? Very sad. But those cells are still there, still talking to mom, right? Hold me, take care of me, love me, whatever, help me, mom. So that's beyond what we knew before. And it's a survival mechanism. And sometimes stays very powerful. My older sister, who passed away in November, my nephew, her son, passed away probably 3 years before that. And she had a very difficult time letting go. And people say, oh, she should let it go, she should let it go. He's gone, make peace with it. Easier said than done now, I know, because it's not just like emotionally letting go. We have a cellular sort of system that continues to say, take care of me, I'm here, hold me, love me, right? Here's the other part of the research. So, the heart is related to Alzheimer's disease because sometimes it's the blood flow to the brain. So people with APOE4 genetic variant also get heart disease along with Alzheimer's, right? The good news is this, Alzheimer's and heart disease. A lot of populations have had this, Alzheimer's and heart disease. It's the inability to transport, cholesterol and LDL particles out of the blood system so they don't clog up the arteries. But here's the fix. We know from hunter-gatherer populations who have more frequency of this genetic variant than we do. They eat a diet that's high in plants and a lot of fiber, right? And they don't get, 1/10 of what we have in terms of Alzheimer's in the industrialized world because of what we eat and the lack of exercise. Anyway, that's kind of a side note. People are worried about Alzheimer's. If you know people with Alzheimer's, 40% of the people with a genetic variant, one copy of an APOE4, it looks like get Alzheimer's disease. But most people don't, if you take care of yourself. 40% of the people that get Alzheimer's disease don't have this genetic variant. It's lifestyle, right? Western living lifestyle. Anyway, I get carried away on some of these things, so let me stay focused here. So the idea here is that the heart is related. And so when the science looked at the heart of these mothers who had Alzheimer's and found the cells of the babies in their brain, what do you suppose they found in the hearts of women who had had a heart event, like a heart attack? They also found the cells of the baby that had migrated to mom's heart and had patched up the damage in the heart. The baby cells migrated to mom's heart when she had a heart attack and patched it up. Baby taking care of mom. Science says, okay, well, that's pretty cool, but don't jump your gun here. It's not like the baby says, I'm so benevolent that I'm going to do this. The baby says, I need you around, so I'm going to patch you up, right? But this is how it works. This is how the body works at this molecular level. So it's not just that, we have this relationship. It's the relationship that goes very deep. And so we can pass on these traits. That's been shown over and over again. Telomeres. How many people have ever heard of telomeres? On the end, there are caps on the end of the chromosomes. And that's gotten really a lot of study lately. Why is that related to mindfulness? Why is that related to, indigenous ways of knowing? Well, one of the things we know is that on the end of the caps, kids are born normally with longer telomeres that protect this chromosome. As we get older, we get a cane, glasses, and we get kind of holding his back there, right? This old guy. He's got his little mustache, It's like telomeres get shorter. And that's what happens, until they can't divide, the cells can't divide anymore in the telomeres, and all of a sudden then we start getting the diseases of aging, right? So they protect our genetic data. They're very important in terms of, telling us whether or not we're going to get cancer or any of these kinds of diseases. Long telomeres are really important, even as we get older, right? We can keep them long, right, by doing certain things. So when they die, the cells become inactive or senescent. Even when cells become inactive, a lot of us have inactive cells in our bodies right now that are not doing anything but just sitting there. And so when they sit there, oftentimes after a period of time, they help form cancer in our bodies. I remember I mentioned fasting. Intermittent fasting, 72 hours for most people, can clean out a lot of these old damaged cells. So again, it's all part of what I've been talking about. Telomeres, they get shorter, higher risk of cancer, death, and so people compare them to a bomb fuse, right? Good telomeres, long. Short telomeres, not so good. So some research on this, right? And this is all of chronic stress, right? What happens? Well, we know that, middle-aged people who are physically active have better aerobic capacities, but they also have longer telomeres than people that are inactive, which means they're more protected against cancer and the diseases of aging, right? And they're similar to younger people. But this is how powerful chronic stress is. They're short for people who are depressed and healthy, but we're showing chronic stress, right? Well, what does that mean? That means you can go run every day, you can sit on a cushion, and you can meditate, you can go to the gym or whatever, but if you can't get that chronic stress out and let it go, it doesn't make any difference. The body doesn't read that. It still reads the chronic stress. That's how powerful it is. So you can go to CrossFit every day, but if you've got chronic stress in your life, it's going to continue to wear on you and shorten your telomeres. A lot of the people were in this particular study were depressed, exhibited higher levels of cortisol dysregulation, and cortisol dysregulation, of course, probably contributes to shorter telomeres. What is cortisol dysregulation? Well, it's the feeling like, I don't feel well, something's going to happen, right? I was talking about the leopards yesterday and spiders and all that sort of thing. So some of us have leopards and spiders every day, right? fears of things. And sometimes it's not any of our fault. We have a particular genetic variant I'll talk about a little later called a COMP gene, and there's all kinds of genes here, like ADRA2B and whatever. These are really important genes for us to understand. And social workers and people in indigenous studies, they want to understand people. They really need to understand, our genetic inheritance, right? Anyway, don't want to get going on too far here. Shorter telomeres. So let's talk about kids. Here's what we know. Kids, and this is, very intuitive, the stressful home environment and genes that encode certain neurotransmitters that heighten the effects of that stress, like norepinephrine, they're always on alert, right? Actually, telomere length is associated with that. So we know from this other study here, this is, over 10 years old, more studies have gone on, but kids in the most stressful homes had telomeres on the average that were 40% shorter than kids that live in the most loving homes. Makes sense, doesn't it? Your telomeres, chronic stress, they're going to go down. Adverse childhood experiences, if you've studied that, then this is another part to that that helps fill out a bigger part of the puzzle. What does that mean then, kids with shorter telomeres? Well, if they are the diseases of aging, that means that kids are beginning to be little old people at the molecular level. Kids are little old people. They're going to get the diseases, of aging much sooner. Cancers, obesity, diabetes, brain tumors, whatever, the diseases of aging are. And they're going to activate in the expression of particular genes that they carry and end up with, different forms of disease that may have never expressed in their life had they lived in a happy home, a place without the stress, or, delayed them until very old age. So I always say it's a crime against humanity to me to know that we can leave children in a place that's unsafe and they're vulnerable. Because now we have the information to know that they're not just affected psychologically, right? They're affected at a molecular level, a very deep level, and it takes this kind of effort that I've been talking about since yesterday, these kinds of ceremony and procedures to begin to re-lengthen those telomeres. It's another one. Mothers, again, pass on shorter telomeres to children. When kids are born, they should have nice long telomeres. But mothers who have been stressed, have eaten the standard American diet and become, and had obesity with that, and of course, all these different factors, right? Elizabeth Blackburn is Nobel Prize winner. She's the person that studied telomeres. And through their work, they determined that mothers that are exposed to life factors that shorten their telomeres, we're talking about chronic stress, pass those on to the baby, right? So one of the major issues, a big deal, is eating the standard American diet rather than a traditional ancestral diet that would have come from traditional territory. Just being mindful about where your food comes from, right? Can be just as powerful as sitting on a cushion or whatever it is. That's how related these things are. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor I talked about yesterday for a bit, but I want to give you an example of that. BDNF is important because BDNF is affected by chronic stress, right? And brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or the big darn native fella, again, promotes, neurons from dying and neuron growth, right? So here's an example here. Bullying. This was an interesting study that was done. This mouse here, this white mouse is bullying this white mouse is bullying this smaller indigenous brown mouse. Oh, no. Did I say that? I mean brown mouse, But what happens is the bullying and chronic stress, right? And that creates an increase in the BDNF in the brain. And that's a good thing because it's protecting this little brown mouse's, cells from dying off, right? That's a really good thing. But what we know is that it also activates genes in the front part of the brain that produce higher levels of social anxiety, withdrawal, and depression. So there you've got The body trying to protect the brain, the BDNF, don't die, brain-derived neurotrophic factor being poured on there from the bullying. But on the other side, we're getting a lot of social anxiety and, withdrawal and depression. What we know is that, there's this signaling process that happens, right? BDNF. And that signaling process that goes on between the high levels of social anxiety and depression and this raised BDNF, participates in what they call a pathophysiology of depression and suicide. We think suicide is just a social act. People get depressed, they share symptoms. Now we know that it happens again at a molecular and a cellular level, right? And a neurochemical level when you're being bullied and constantly, feeling that stress. Someone doesn't even have to be physically at that moment bullying you, but you can be reflecting on all the times that you were treated badly. You feel bullied. You feel, danger, right? Brain doesn't make any distinction. It just registers danger. So that's what happens when you... So I showed this in Canada. Oh, they really laughed. You guys barely laughed, but they... So, there it is again. Won't go away. All right, let's go on. So most of the research that's gone on in mindfulness, mindfulness is this, people talk about it. I was talking with someone who does a lot of Zen, who's been teaching Zen for years, and, and was talking about mindfulness. There's kind of two forms, right? One form is calming mindfulness, right? Give you a sense of peace and well-being. And the other part is like insight, and enlightenment, right? So it's like, another person was talking about yoga, a person who was a very traditional person, and said, yoga has become like so westernized that, doing certain breathing and certain kinds of positions are supposed to lead to this transformation and enlightenment, right? Since it's arrived in the West, it's changed quite a bit. So mindfulness has changed quite a bit. But I think about it in terms of, mindfulness, the practice, learning how to just train your awareness, is a very indigenous thing, because then you go on to all these other practices that are mindfulness practices. So what about it? What we know is that, there are all these neurobiological things that happen when you practice mindfulness, right? Good thing is that we know from research is that, changes happen pretty quickly. Only after 11 hours of practice, 30-minute sessions, we begin to see, through imaging, changes in the white matter in the brain, and what they call myelin sheath that covers nerves that go back and forth that talk about, the brain talks to itself, this connectivity. Right? A lot of this is disrupted in people that we see with Parkinson's as well as MS. The myelin sheath, the white matter, begins to be attacked by the body in an autoimmune disorder, right? If it's MS. And that's where we get the rigidity, and it's hard. People have these, the brain isn't contacting with itself very efficiently. Connectivity is poor. This is my second youngest again. Remember the Netflix she was waiting for? So. But all the girls, she's doing belly breathing, right? It's kind of this pranayama, belly breathing from the belly kind of thing. So I get them to practice different techniques. But anyway, so we know even more, 45 minutes a day for 8 weeks changes brain structures associated with memory and the gray matter in the brain. What's interesting about Western science is that, they have these protocols that last 8 weeks or 12 weeks or even a year or whatever, and then they try to determine whether or not something is effective, right? And that's not the point. The point of, this more transformative kind of practice is that, a person practices for years until you move on. I was a martial artist for many years, so, I went the old style, that you don't buy a contract and get a black belt, in a year or something, that you start with a white belt, and like the old days, it gets dirtier and dirtier and dirtier until it becomes a black belt, right? But that was the old style, and dirt floors and stuff. But it was the same thing with meditation, right? So you've got, different kinds of practices and people. But anyway, the point is, what you have going on here is you have increases in gray matter, which protect certain parts of the brain and reduce function in other parts of the brain, like the amygdala, which is a fear part of the brain that kind of controls, that fear and so on. The insula, another part of the brain. This is side view, back view, top view, and you can see the activation here. Well, it's associated with, this gut feeling, this interoception, right? And it's also really involves, the body that's generating our subjective feelings, right? How do I feel? How do I feel at this moment? What's going on with my body? And a lot of times it's hard to know that until you sit down and calm yourself and you begin to see, I didn't know that. I just got done with a sit and I found out, I have a really bad ache in my back or whatever, right? But this other finding is that it controls mental emotions and regulation of the body's homeostasis. So yesterday when I talked about these young Yurok men doing this particular ceremonial run through the mountains, and the part of their brain, does anybody know what part of their brain was being activated for the cognitive resilience? Does anybody remember? Yeah, it's in front. Do you remember the, say it again? Yeah, very mad. See, you remember that, right? Very mad private first class, but you don't remember the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, right? You don't remember that. What the hell is that, right? So again, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the very mad private first class, is in that prefrontal cortex, underneath supporting that resilience there, right? And that's what it's doing. So we got another factor involved with that, because the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, and that part of the brain is helping with risk, and assessing the risk, and also morality, and also assessing, all these different aspects, right, that help build cognitive resilience. And here we got another factor, the insula. See, here's where the, this part of the brain is where the VMPFC would be here. So the insula there is also being activated, controls mental emotions, right? Feeling, I don't feel safe, I feel, whatever. So you got two things that are going on. This happens, with the mindfulness sitting and meditation. But I also think it happens with the running or the swimming or the dancing and those kinds of things. And it enables one to control negative emotions, just like running does, just like sitting in a hot sauna does, just like sitting with all your friends and laughing your butt off, is going to help you control your mental emotions. And so you have all these factors and all these different parts of the brain that are activated. I'm not just talking about sitting on a cushion in meditation. I'm talking about all these, practices, these ceremonies that you do. So here's another one, part of the brain that's affected by meditation, right? It's called the temporal parietal junction, the TPJ. And what we know about this particular part of the brain is that it's a top-down modulation, meaning that, what happens is it starts happening high, then it kind of brings it back down to the occipital part of the brain, which is actually the seeing part of the brain. The parietal is kind of this really interesting part of the brain, that's about sensory experience. And I'll talk a little more about that. But what we know is that it's associated with this emotional and mental intelligence, right? This is what I believe. I think that it's not only the emotional and mental intelligence of other people, but it's other things that exist in the world. For example, I have this friend who's a Yupik woman in Bethel, Alaska. Her name is Esther Green. She must be about 87 years old right now. And I met Esther a few years ago when I used to go to Bethel and do work up at Bethel with their human resource, or the human, the Human Resources Studies Program, or whatever it is. Rural Human Resources, yeah. And I met Esther, and I was talking about some of this stuff, and she was sitting there and listening, and she said, she started talking about, the emotional state of others. And she said, what we Yupik people do is sometimes when we're on the beach, We walk along the beach, he said, and we look at a piece of wood. And sometimes that wood is shaped like this, and it's been in the sand for a long time. What we go is, we go and we take that piece of wood and we turn it over like that so that wood can rest a little bit on the other side because it's had its side too long in the sand. We feel like that wood feels better after we do that. And I thought, wow, that's pretty fascinating, pretty amazing stuff because, you know, she's really, that part of her brain was activated when she was doing that. She was, you know, really getting in touch with that wood, the emotional state and the mental state of that wood. You know, her emotional intelligence goes beyond just people, but it goes to animals, it goes to, you know, things that we think are not sentient or alive, like pieces of wood, right? And I'm thinking, wow, you know, very, very mindfulness, a big part of mindfulness. So we know that this part of the brain that gives us that mental, emotional intelligence, you know, more active in meditators than non-meditators. Right? So let's get to some traditional mindfulness practices. Let's see here. This here, I don't think I've talked about this yet. This is a book that we did a few years ago for Indigenous minds only. And there it is, okay. So I talked about neurodecolonization, but I don't think I talked about the, did I talk about this yesterday, about the, okay, so let me, so this part of our book, Decolonizing the Mind is of course, you know, through the traditional sense. What happened here is, what's happening here is my brother did this, you know, painting on ledger paper, and this is the brain. This is the brain on ceremony. You have this man here smudging the brain and praying over it, and this man singing to the brain. And as they sing to the brain traditional music and they do the traditional ceremony, you can see, if you can see that, there's all these little horses that are, you know, leaving the brain. So I asked my brother, I said, because he's a horse guy, I said, well, why'd you paint those horses there, you know? And he said, well, he said, you're always talking about neurons firing. That's what's going on. These horses here are the neurons firing from different part of the cortices. So where are they going? Well, they're going back to the villages, he said, back to the traditional way. And ceremony, prayer, and, you know, singing, all those things will liberate our brains from colonialism if we go back to the villages. And of course, he said, in our culture, we're a highly matriarchal tribe. Women there, this woman here who, you know, makes everything grow, is, if you could see that, she's kind of, her fingertip has kind of got the spark of life, you know, through all these four directions there. So and then I said, well, you put it on ledger paper, because he's a ledger artist. And he says, well, yeah, ledger is about colonialism, isn't it? You know, ledger paper, you see this and you'll say, well, this is where, you know, all the stuff was here. The ledger says, this is how many Indians were arrested, you know, or because they were practicing their religion, and their names are on there and whatever. He said, but, he said, our culture, if we keep it strong, will always be on top of colonialism. You know, that's the symbol, that's the idea, that's the understanding. That's how powerful our culture is. So, neurodecolonization, then I think I talked about that a bit, but you know, the mindfulness practices that we're talking about, just sitting on the cushion and learning how to calm your mind and learning how to, you know, find peace, that's one piece of it. But the enlightenment and the insight that comes from this then comes from ceremony and understanding, you know, who we are as people. That's when we begin to get the enlightenment by doing those things, by running, by fasting, by being in ceremony, by singing, by beating, by whatever it is that we do, you know, whatever ceremonies we do. So this is one of my fellow tribesmen here. And he is sitting, this is about 1903. So people have been doing this for a long time. They've been doing meditation, you know, in this part of the world. The reason we don't know much about indigenous meditation is because it was wiped out by settlers and colonialism. So folks went and brought Eastern meditative practices to Turtle Island, but yet long before that, we had this kind of practice here. So this man is doing what we would call maybe, sacred object meditation, focusing and training his awareness on this, or maybe he's looking for enlightenment, through these sacred pipes that he's gazing at here, right? But one of the things is that, his belief about these sacred objects help his neurons to grow, calls upon these objects at difficult times. What's happening in his brain is really important too. If we look at here at baseline, you see in the left prefrontal cortex there, what they call hemodynamic activity or blood flow in the brain is broken. It's not connected. But when he gets into this meditative state, left prefrontal cortex becomes highly activated. And we know that from all the research that's gone on by people that have been neuroscientists and are neuroscientists and who are long-term meditators, we know from brain imaging that the left prefrontal cortex houses happiness, optimism, feelings of well-being, and joy. So this man clearly is feeling that right now, purpose and joy as he looks at these sacred pipes of the people. Well, there's a lot going on in his brain, as you can see by the difference in these brain scans. Another thing is that here, at baseline, you see the occipital lobe mentioned earlier, which is the seeing part of the brain, is activated, but it's connected and sort of not as bright. Here we've got more brightness as well as a connection. Well, what does that mean? Short, what it means is that he's seeing beyond the pipes. He's seeing them, but he's getting more activation in that part of the brain. So not only is he seeing the pipes, he may be seeing the people that handed them down. He may be seeing the ceremony. He may be seeing the ceremony that was done to take the willows or the stalks, or the branches and the songs that were sung, to take the stems for the pipe. He may be seeing, where people went and did the ceremony to get the pipestone out of the earth and the songs that were sung. He's seeing all these things, right? And he's remembering that. It's very significant, right? Because it's sacred to him. It's ceremony, right? And we can see what kind of effect it's having on its brain. Giving him the ability to see beyond, giving him an ability to feel a sense of optimism, well-being, purpose, right? That's how powerful these ceremonies are. Now we have a fix and understand why these ceremonies were so important for our ancestors and how it made sense to them, why it made sense. This is another one here that is really an important one because these are, again, guys from my tribe, probably some of my relatives in here. And they're doing a ceremony where they're singing to the cedar tree. Cedar tree in our tribe was a source of life, and there's stories around that. The cedar tree was a female. It was a mother. It was a grandmother. And what the men did here, this particular slide, this again, 1903 was. These ones were taken by Edward Curtis in a book called The Vanishing Indian, right? When he went out and did all these slides. The Indians are going to vanish. They're no longer going to be around. When take some pictures, And of course, we didn't vanish. We changed it a bit. But as you can see here, these guys are, some of my age, some are younger, but very different, stature. These guys were taller too, right? Because of their diet, more fit than we are today. But what's going on is they're singing to this tree. And this is really interesting research because this has been done, and I used this as a proxy to figure out what was going on when they're singing to the cedar tree. And by that I mean, as they sang to the cedar tree, they called her mother, grandmother, sister, whatever, and she was real. She was, to them, a living being. She had sentience. She was, even more than a being. She was sacred. And so they sang these songs to her. Guess what? They didn't sing one song or two songs. They didn't sing for an hour or a day or a week. They sang longer. It's kind of interesting because a lot of these Buddhist retreats that people go on are like 90-day retreats. So some of these are 90-day ceremonies where you could sit and stand in front of a tree and sing to that tree for 90 days, day after day. Change the song, change the feeling, change the prayers, and go over and over again. Well, that's tough. It's a lot of endurance, right? But what we know now is that from the research on Buddhist monks who have had long, long hours of meditation and prayer, not only monks but a number of other folks, we know that when people begin to reach that state where they see this sacredness and they really do move and transcend into a different place, this part of the brain, the parietal lobe here, look at that, compared to that side, goes quiet. Why is that important? Well, the parietal lobe is a part of our brain that's about spatial reasoning, that tells these men and me, and if I'm standing here at the ceremony, that I'm not that tree. Tree is not me. There's a distance between that tree. But as they sing to that tree longer and longer and longer and become more convinced this tree is alive and this tree has sentience, this part of the brain goes quiet. And then they actually have a very physiological response of connection to that tree. What does that mean? The distance between themselves and the tree disappears. They become the tree. The tree becomes them. They're the branches, the leaves, the needles. They're the roots. They're the fragrance. Just like the Buddha during his meditation could, see the connection between all things, the unified field, that theory that Einstein talks about, all the connection between things. In order to reach that state on a physiological, neurobiological level, you have to quiet down that part of the parietal lobe so that there's no distance between you and that piece of wood on the beach, or that tree out there, or the strawberries that you prayed about yesterday, or the deer, right? We now know how enlightenment works from the brain. It takes a long time to activate that part of the brain, but that's, for all intents and purposes, the neurobiological explanation for enlightenment. And it takes it takes a while, and our people used to achieve that often. That's why now they were connected to all these things. How we got our names, I don't know Ojibwe's names, but in my tribe we have all these names that are connected to animals and the stars. My father's name was Stidi Hidanut, which meant Wolf Trail, which really was the Milky Way. I've got all these different names in our families that have connection to outside the world of the earth. So I thought this was a pretty cool slide because it tells us a lot now about enlightenment. But of course, the telomeres get longer and all these good things happen. Traditional indigenous contemplative mindfulness, again, long tradition. Here we see this Rikara man engaged in a mindfulness practice here up on this platform, sitting in this position, singing these songs, very ritualized, and of course, all these different factors happening. Changes we see in the brain waves, in the insula, and of course, changes that are happening in the language center as he says the prayer. Let me see what's here. Right. See it? Can't see it, I guess. But on the language center there, when you pray enough and when you sing enough in your brain, all you have to do is think of the song or think of the prayer, and the language center will activate like you're really singing the song. My dad was a musician. He was a jazz musician. Very good. I'm a musician. I'm a jazz musician. I'm nothing like my dad. I just get out and blow my horn every now and then. My dad is very good. But he'd sit there during the day, sometimes, weekends when he played all these dances, and his foot would constantly kind of move, and he'd be sitting there like this. His foot would be moving like this. And I never knew why he was doing that, but he always did that at home. And then every now and then he'd stop and he'd think for a minute. He'd get up, walk out of the living room, go back to his bedroom, close the door, and then he'd take out his sax and blow these etudes, or he'd blow these scales or blow these notes, and then he'd come back out again. Years later, I figured out, what he was doing was that he was playing this melody, or he was, this improvisation in his head, the phrasing and everything that was going on, and maybe the complexity of a particular piece. And then he'd run into a point where, oh, I don't know what I can do with that. So then he'd have to actually go back and pick up his horn and then play it. And then he'd say, oh, I got it now, right? Come back out. So that was like, that was probably the same thing as the language, center of the brain. Prayer scan, I call that, his jazz scan there for him. So we put some of this together here, the different ceremony and stuff. This is a ceremony that we did, blessing of the children, a couple times a year to bless the kids, because we had a lot of infant mortality in the tribe back in the day. So we know that, as people did this ceremony, I won't talk about it because it's a very long ceremony, things were happening to the DNA, being expressed. We know that, their well-being, occipital lobe, and their left prefrontal cortex are being activated. Chemistry. I didn't talk much about chemistry, but things like acetylcholine. Let's see if I can get this here. And endorphins we talked about earlier, dopamine. We could probably put on here too endocannabinoids. Everything to from melatonin all the way up to serotonin, oxytocin. All these chemicals, are important for balance. And this is one thing we don't really take a lot of into consideration, is that when people become out of balance, chemistry becomes unbalanced. Very difficult to get that chemistry balance unless you begin to practice what I'm talking about, right? I sound like a salesman here, But these ideas, right? Brain waves, activity, change. I don't have enough time to talk about that. But also, parietal lobe. And of course, the telomeres. Let me go on to I know I'm probably going too long. Where's my cutoff sign? 5 minutes? Okay. So these are some of the people that I've worked with. This is my class in Humboldt State, my MSW class. Fort Lewis College, Durango, indigenous students down there. This is North Dakota State University with education students. Diabetes Summit, and my girls and I in 2012 at Arcata, Toronto, working with indigenous people and child welfare providers. More Toronto, another session up there. They invite me up to Toronto quite a bit, so I enjoy going up there. Got kind of good restaurants up there, So some elders in Arizona, that are practicing, different techniques. Indigenous people here, and for indigenous people, it's so natural and normal to do these things because they understand that, mindfulness there. My girl's here. This is my girl, Pachiparino here. She comes to the table late. We kind of do a little short meditation with food. And she was late that morning, so she said, I forgot to do my meditation. So she said, this is my fruit meditation. This is heart resonance here with my girls, Solana and Arundhati. Solana, a little more rambunctious, and so she leans on her sister to calm down. The heart resonates, kind of. We get the heartbeat to resonate. Meditating behind the house, girls meditating, of course, dynamic things going on in the brain. I'll end with this, emotions, the last part of the medicine wheel. And again, I invite you to write this down, take pictures of the slides if you want, because I think genetic inheritance and epigenetics, are really sort of taking the scientific as well as the practice world by storm right now. And I don't have enough time to go into all of what genes are and what they do, but we have a pretty good idea. But I want to talk about different kinds of genetic predispositions we have. This is the FA gene, and this is a variant that relates to happiness, right? Some of us are recipients of having this gene, maybe a copy of this gene, or maybe have two copies. So you see people that are really never down sometimes, right? How do they do it? They're never down, and they live to be 110 years old or whatever. They were genetically endowed, through the lottery system of getting this particular gene, and they carry this genetic factor. Here's what we know, though. We know that happiness, is associated with this gene, but look at this. Look at this. Mexico, Nigeria, Colombia, I mean, you're talking about a lot of indigenous people, and then Sweden. People say, oh, Sweden is the highest of happiness, but we go back here, we got Mexico, folks like this, right? And then Vietnam, war, New Zealand, kind of moving all the way down. Then we start to get to Russia and Romania and Iraq, where there's been a lot of war, and China and so on. So this is where the gene, Peru, right? Indigenous people, Brazil, a lot of indigenous people in here. But we know that this particular allele, this genetic variant, happiness, has different frequencies throughout the world. Right? Who chose that? I don't know, epigenetics, is everywhere now, of course. What you eat, where you live, who you interact with, when you sleep, how you exercise, even aging, all cause these chemical modifications around the genes that, turn them off or on. And certain diseases such as cancer, Alzheimer's, will be switched into an opposite state away from the normal healthy state if we don't exercise, if we don't, bring our awareness, to what we're doing. We don't, all those factors I talked about. Comp gene. I took the 23andMe, so I've put my genetic genes through a number of protocols and different testing sites. It's fun to do. It's also scary because you're like, oh, shit, I got that gene, And, oh, I got this one. This is better, so you're looking at it. Then you get a little bit obsessed with that, right? My mom's 92. She's got a number of markers that are not good, but she's 92 years old. So, genes aren't destiny. But we can, facilitate the process of the expression of bad genes by certain lifestyle, and again, silence them and turn on protective genes with, healthier lifestyle. I took this comp gene that affects my neurotransmitters, my dopamine levels and so on. And the comp gene relates to anxiety, right? So I got my raw 23andMe and I sent it to another provider, and I was thinking, let's see what happens. And it came out that I do have the comp gene, but that's not the issue. The issue is what the variants are. So my variants showed that I have an intermediate level of anxiety, always present, right? Always present. I'm glad I didn't have the high level anxiety because I'd be locked up or heavily medicated. So how do I control that? Just everything I've been talking about. So if you've got anxiety that, is, constant and you feel it, it may be related to lifestyle, but also may be related to what you inherited. Now, what's good about this particular gene is that probably people that had this gene back in the day were pretty good anxiety because they were always on the alert, probably good sentries and watched out for danger. And there's another gene that does that too. So this is the comp gene. It's this gene here called ADRA2B. This one, take note of. If you don't learn anything from the genes or nothing sounds important, this one in particular is a gene that was discovered that has to do with norepinephrine, the alertness chemical, right? Neurotransmitter. So we look at this particular gene plays a role in the formation of emotional experience and memories. There's a particular study that was done that says individuals with this gene are more likely to focus on the negative. Is that you? That's me. I know I have this particular genetic variant. For instance, they may be more likely to pick out angry faces in the crowd of people. Outdoors, they might notice potential hazards, places you could slip, lose on loose rocks. You might fall instead of seeing the beauty of nature. I'm like that with my kids, my girls. Put your seatbelts on. Watch out! Don't step on that manhole. It might open. You'll fall in there. Right? You're going to break a leg. And I'm thinking, why do I do that all the time? My wife's pretty calm and cool about that. She's cruising along. Me, I'm like, all flustered. I teach my kids how to float in case they drown. Right? When they're little kids, when they're babies, put them in the water. Teach them how to cross the road. Always wear your seatbelts. Always brush your teeth. I got all these rules, right? But why, right? And I think probably it's this particular genetic ADRA2B. And of course, you know, when you get sort of overly sort of hyped about that, your norepinephrine levels go up, and you get even more anxiety and more afraid, right? So it's to calm down is the big thing. Is not easier said than done. So here's the really interesting part of it. This gene can cause individuals to perceive emotional events, especially negative ones, more vividly than others. For example, trauma, boarding school or residential school experiences, racism, violence. And part of that is called EEV, the emotional enhanced vividness. If you're a person that, you know, really bad memory stays with, you know, blood and gore and those kinds of things, and if you're working with people that have, you know, PTSD or whatever, and they're having a difficult time getting over PTSD, it may be that they have this genetic variant, ADRA2B, and they experience things more vividly, right? You know what the cool part is about this, though? These people become artists and poets, and they have this, or storytellers, they have this really strong imagination that they can draw from because things are very vivid. Somebody like Stephen King probably has this genetic variant, or people you know, because they can put this into a really gory, dark detail, right? And you're reading like, whoa, you know? So that's what this gene does as well. But it explains why some people are more susceptible to PTSD, why some people can go through residential boarding school and walk through it, and other people can't recover from it. The story goes on and on and on. So decolonizing the hug, right? We've talked about that before, but you know, the thing is that, you know, like kids who hadn't had much contact as babies experience more distress in their early years and so on. Slower epigenetic aging, less favorable development progress, right? So, you know, hugging is in the DNA, right? Let's see, I think this is the last slide. I'm going to end with this one here. This is the NR3CL variant. And this research has been done, and it talks a lot about, like, you know, what the resiliency of kids, right? What's the difference between a dandelion and an orchid? These are flowers. What's the difference between the two? Anybody know? Sensitive, yes. What about dandelions? Well, they grow any damn place, don't they? You got to go after them with Agent Orange. You do. That's Roundup. That's what they use on them. Yeah, they're beautiful, but we don't think so. Most of us don't. You know, we got to, yeah, you can eat them, right? Yeah, but if you let too many grow in your yard, then pretty soon people are going to call the city council and say, you know, I don't want dandelions in my yard. This guy is not, you know, taking care of his dandelions. That's what happens in Fargo, you know. I let my dandelions grow. I say, I'm indigenous, man. Come on. But kids are like that. Genetic variant that exists today, right? This, again, cortisol, adrenaline-like receptor, right? It's directly involved in the stress response. We know that the dandelion kids are the hardy kids. They're going to get through most anything in life. You know, they've seen the adverse childhood experiences, and they said, yep, this all happened, but, you know, I'm glad I'm still alive, and I'm doing pretty good, right? The orchid kids probably committed suicide on the way, or something happened more drastic. The interesting thing about the research that shows now is the dandelion kids get through life, but they don't reach the level of creativity as the orchid kids. They're going to be, you know, they're going to be strong, average, good kids, growing strong, average adults, pass on their genes, so their kids are going to be like that. The orchid kids, on the other hand, are very vulnerable to stress, and they, you know, have very difficult times. But what we know, again, like I mentioned earlier with the ADRA2B gene, is the orchid children, if you give them the right support and encouragement and love, touching and holding, they become the artists, the storytellers. Brilliance begins to flourish there because there's something inherent about that, you know, with these kids. Right. So I'm going to end there, and I know that, you know, some of you may have questions. I don't know if you want to take questions now or whatever, but this is the last part of the medicine wheel and all the factors. So genetic inheritance is really important. We never considered it before, But now we have, through the decade of the human genome and these studies that are going on, we know that we're paying more and more attention to these different variants. Now, they're not genes are not destiny, but for many people that have been through chronic stress and have been challenged, they they activate. And again, good news is a lot of these genes expression can be turned off by changing your lifestyle. Everything I talked about, I try to relate it back to indigenous ways of knowing, very simple prescriptions and the reasons for that. So I want to thank you for your attention and for the invitation to be here. And I don't know if we have time for questions or if you want to move on. I'm cool either way. Looking at each other. The indecision gene. Okay. Yeah, question? Yeah. How does this relate to psychopathology? Psychopathology is such an old term that's become archaic now in my mind because there are a lot of reasons people behave the way that they behave that we didn't know before. Psychopathology, like psychodynamics, is what I learned when I was in school, is like you had this field of like normal behavior. Now we know that people have different kinds of behavior for different reasons and behaviors that, of course, at one point in our history had an advantage. Anxiety had an advantage back in the day because you didn't want to get eaten by leopards, so you'd have to, stay focused or whatever. Today we'd call that, I don't know what we'd call it, give a DSM-4 sort of whatever on that. But, that's how complex and how new the science has become now that we're looking at like, wow, DSM-4 was created off this, this old model that there was a normal behavior when there's, really not a normal behavior. So.
I was thinking in regards to Robert Harris study, psychopath scale or
Yeah.
scale. I mean, how does he be able to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's been done for a long period of time, right? I mean, people used to give electrical shocks, and they used to do lobotomies, and now people medicate, that stop certain receptors or certain kinds of messaging that goes on in the brain, disrupting chemistry, for one thing. And now people are talking about knocking out genes, genes that express in particular kinds of ways. So that science is still kind of moving in that direction. It's kind of, like a neuroeugenics kind of thing, right? We want the people to act all the same way and function the same way under the same parameter. But it's complex, because once interactions, once you knock out something over here, then, we don't know exactly what the end result's going to be when you mess with Mother Nature, right? So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Useful programs, like at the academic level? Yeah, horticulture. That's at the academic level. But I think, there's a lot of things people are doing, and like I talked about yesterday, it seems to me that what seems to govern a lot of our behavior, not govern, but what seems to be compatible are these things that I was talking about, right? Being outside. Remember I showed that slide about the new miracle drug about being outside, right? Getting your hands in the earth, eating dirt, is all this kind of stuff is all sort of gone back to original sort of ancestral teachings, how people used to interact, right? Don't wear your shoes. Walk outside without shoes. Why? 2 reasons. Strengthen your feet. When you get older, you have better balance, right? That's why people have a lot of falls today. They wear shoes. They got the muscles in their feet are not, strong to balance them. The other reason, people in energy psychology would say, well, don't wear shoes because shoes block the beta ions coming from the earth, the negative, flow. Oh, here we got a positive flow. That's why you have a lot of illnesses and inflammation in the body. Shoes were the worst invention because they don't allow you to get the Earth's, beta energies coming up, the ions that are coming up. research is being done on that, you know. So it's natural ancestral ways of living that people are turning back towards. That's where intermittent fasting came from. Now it's a big thing, right? And I talked to you about how there's Indians up in, we're dealing with this Jesuit missionary talking about how natural it was to go 3 days without eating and still have humor, right? So I don't think of programs in that way, but I think about how we live, you know, with the earth, how we live with ourselves and things that we do. So, yeah. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, you know, I don't know too much about that, you know, about trauma is, you know, in my mind, different complex processes, you know, memory, hippocampus, you know, and it's also a factor, too, that is important. Whether or not we think trauma is important, it's a survival mechanism, part of the memory, so that we, you know, we don't get exposed to that kind of thing again, the trauma, to remember that. That's how human beings are. They have the hippocampus, the memory, you know, factor for big traumatic events to remember those kinds of things so they don't go back into that. So what we have to do in that way is to kind of teach the brain that, you know, it's no longer real, just a memory, because the body reacts to that. So exercise, yeah, can for a moment quiet some of those kinds of things, but trauma, again, I think is, like I mentioned, is very complex. Can get all the way down to your, you know, dendritic spines, can get all the way down to your telomeres, can get all the way down to enzymatic or molecular cellular processes. And you may be wired. You may be wired for that. You may have the genetic ADRA2B, the EEV, the emotionally enhanced variant of this particular gene that says, you know, it's always going to be there and it's going to be lighting up. But now I can treat it as something over here, and that it's not real, but it's there. It's going to visit me often, right? So it's complex. You know? It's complex, not one size fits all and nothing. You know, if anyone tells you that this is how you do trauma, then, you know, then maybe it is. But from research that I've done, it just doesn't seem like there's just one pathway through it. And in some cases, for some people, it's a survival mechanism. So, all right. Thank you.
Take a moment to thank Tanya and Pamela and Andrew from our team in Native American Studies helping behind the scenes. So thank you to them. I'm happy and delighted to introduce our next trainer here with us today. Susan Allen is a former member of the Minnesota House of Representatives, and she came to us highly recommended from one of our recent NMU graduates, who said that she saw her Susan Allen speak up in Baraga. I believe it was the Anishinaabe Racial Justice Conference, and so she was very excited. She wanted to make sure that we included Susan and her energy, talent, and gifts on our as part of our training. Susan is a member of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, DFL. She was the first Native American woman to serve in the Minnesota legislature. Susan is Lakota, Dakota, and Anishinaabe. Her father was from the Pine Ridge Reservation and her mother from the Rosebud Reservation, both in South Dakota. She is a member of Rosebud Sioux Tribe in South Dakota. Susan is a two-spirited being, and as noted in an interview from Slate.com in 2016, two-spirited from an indigenous perspective means in terms of spiritual essence rather than biological, physiological identity, with the specifics of gender expression varying from tribe to tribe. As an attorney, Allen specializes in serving Indian tribes, helping them draft tribal laws in a wide range of areas. And the Star Tribune shared that fellow lawmakers in Minnesota described her as thoughtful, gracious voice who didn't shy away from debates. Does any Indian woman shy away from debates? But rock on, rock on. As reported in 2012, Allen follows a family tradition of activism. She has served on the board of the Iqua Law Center, Indigenous Peoples Task Force, and the Indian Neighborhood Club on Alcohol and Drugs. Susan was part of the Minnesota's first ever caucus of Native women. That sounds powerful, beautiful trouble right there. Adding their names to more than a dozen bills that specifically tackled issues related to the American Indian community, Allen earned a Juris Doctorate from the University of New Mexico Law School and an LLM from William Mitchell College of Law in St. Paul. Please join me in welcoming Representative Susan Allen here to Northern Michigan University.
Thank you. Little trip down memory lane there from my legislative days, which ended in the end of last year. Served 7 years. So I went in Minnesota. Working in the legislature is supposed to be part-time, but I work in private practice as an attorney, not government, and so I had to maintain both jobs during that time, and you can only do that for so long. We do, if there are government attorneys, they can. Under state law in Minnesota, they don't lose their seniority. They're not assigned cases during the session. So there's still some attorneys left there, but there are still 2 Native women left in the Minnesota legislature, and now we have a lieutenant governor who is a former legislator who is now serving, Peggy Flanagan, who's from White Earth Nation. So that is. So I just came away from, I'm primarily a tax attorney. So I did 2 presentations training the Yankton Sioux Tribe Tax Commission, and then the Minnesota American Indian Bar Association did a tax training. So I'm going to switch back a little bit to something where this area is not my specialty of law, but it is an area that is very personal in that it is about violence, gender-based violence, and many of you serve those who are victims or have family members or seen the devastation of gender-based violence in our tribal communities. And so I wanted to start with just a little presentation of half of it of the gender-based violence, which is really the Violence Against Women Act, and then the Tribal Law and Order Act. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background first. And so let me put this in a little bit of context. I'm going to read just a paragraph here from a law review article from Jessica Allison, and I can provide the link to that article. It's titled Beyond VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women Act, Protecting Native Women from Sexual Violence Within Existing Tribal Jurisdictional Structures. This will give you a little bit of the background. I'll read the introduction. Diane Milich, a member of the Southern Ute tribe, was 26 when her new husband, a white man, moved in with her on her tribe's reservation in southwestern Colorado. He began to abuse her, and law enforcement could do nothing about it. Because her husband was non-Indian, the tribal police had no jurisdiction, and because she was an Indian woman on tribal lands, local law enforcement had no jurisdiction either. In fact, on one occasion, her husband called the tribal police and the local sheriff's department on himself to show her that no one could stop him. After Milich filed for divorce, he came to her workplace and opened fire. Her co-worker was injured when he took a bullet for her. It took hours for investigators to measure where the gun was when Milich's husband fired it and where her co-worker was standing to determine that local law enforcement had jurisdiction. Even then, Milich's husband wasn't arrested for several weeks because he fled to New Mexico. He ultimately took a deal and pled guilty to only aggravated driving under revocation. This is the reality for many American Indian women. 39% of American Indian women experience domestic violence in their lifetime, and more than 1/3 are raped. Yet sexual violence was virtually
non-existence prior to colonization. Traditionally, women in many Indian societies were respected and influential members of the community. Tribes did not tolerate rape, and it was punished harshly in the rare instances it occurred. In the Iroquois nation, for example, a man could not hold a leadership position if he had ever sexually assaulted a woman. In the Muskogee Creek nation, traditionally allowed the victim to determine the punishment for sexual violence as she saw fit. By contrast, European society widely used rape to threaten or punish women. This dynamic played out during the colonization of North America, as rape is an exercise of hostile, aggressive power instead of an act of sexuality. As Indian women were assaulted by European men, the underlying social and legal sanction of rape as a means of control infiltrated tribal belief systems through the process of assimilation. However, Europeans' use of sexual violence as a means of control is not the only reason why rape against women perpetrated by non-Indian men persists at such startling rates today. Another reason is the fact that the United States has systematically stripped tribes of the ability to effectively punish sexual offenders. So this is what led to the VAWA. But it is a long road to get there. We know that tribes are sovereign, they pre-exist discovery, and that in the 1830s, if you study, is there any attorneys here? If you study Indian law, is the Marshall trilogy, Chief Justice Marshall, Cherokee versus Worcester, those cases where the Chief Justice said that Dominion discovery did not mean that it abrogated the existing people's sovereign rights. And so from that point on, it was based on treaty making, and the court explained that treaties were that the tribes retained all sovereign rights unless they were ceded by the treaty. So they reserved their sovereignty, they ceded land. And so in the very beginning, the court said that they had lost their sovereignty only with respect to control land, to pass title to the land. They did not have title. They had the right of occupancy, but they did not have the right to transfer title. And then in the 1700s, the Trade and Intercourse Act was passed, and that gave the federal government exclusive right to deal with Indian tribes. So no U.S. citizen could enter into any agreement with a tribe unless it was approved by the United States government. So the first criminal federal statute, and so these statutes I'm going to talk about are a way that the Congress has intruded into tribal sovereignty, its internal relations, and stripped tribes of sovereignty. And so the first one was the General Crimes Act, which was crimes between, it was a murder between one Indian and another Indian, and the federal government for the first time assumed criminal jurisdiction over crimes on tribal reservations. And then that followed with the Major Crimes Act. The Major Crimes Act, this gave the federal government jurisdiction over 7 major crimes, murder, and one of them was rape. And so from that would be in the 1850s. And so from that point on, there really was not, tribes no longer exercised jurisdiction over those major crimes. It just, even though they had the authority, the Major Crimes Act did not strip tribes of sovereign authority to prosecute major crimes.
but often it was a case that they didn't have the resources to do it, and they deferred to the federal government, and there was a misunderstanding about that. But the thing about the Major Crimes Act is that it didn't mandate that the federal government prosecute those crimes. It just gave them jurisdiction. And so even today, there are only 120 3 or 5 or 25 federal agents that are assigned jurisdiction or have within their service area for 573 tribes. So we move on to the Public Law 280, which is only in 5 states. Minnesota, where I'm from, gave states criminal jurisdiction over tribes. Much, much broader than federal. The federal was only crimes between Indians and the 7 major crimes. But the states got complete criminal jurisdiction, including prosecution of misdemeanors. And again, you're in the same position where you have the tribes are with a state who has covering vast areas, limited number of officers, and a very difficult to prosecute, to investigate for states to do that. And then we come to the Indian Civil Rights Act, which was in the 70s, 78. This further diminished tribal sovereignty and imposed constitutional due process requirements on tribes, criminal proceedings, and it limited tribes to not be able to impose sentences greater than 6 months. And so, again, so if given the, oftentimes it's not even practical, you arrest somebody while they're waiting for arraignment, to be charged, to set a date. Oftentimes that 6 months is gone. And so oftentimes before the individual gets out of jail, they might even be in there for 12 months and then they've served their time. So it's not something that gets, sexual assault or rape crimes do not typically get prosecuted. They were not typically prosecuted in the 70s. And then we get to Oliphant, which is a turning point in Indian law. Because remember what I said before? I said that tribes are divested of sovereignty only if Congress abrogates it by statute expressly. So, or if a tribe in a treaty cedes that right. In Oliphant, it was 2 non-Indians that were in a dispute, and the tribe, the estate didn't want to assert jurisdiction, so the tribe prosecuted it, and people were like outraged, like that a tribe would be prosecuting 2 non-Indians. So that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said that tribes did not have jurisdiction over crimes committed by non-Indians on the reservation, and that was in 1978, I believe. And how they arrived to that conclusion, because it's contrary to the 1830 cases, is that the court said that tribes were implicitly divested of jurisdiction, that it was called implicit divestiture. Basically what that meant was that tribes never had jurisdiction over non-Indians, therefore it couldn't exercise something it didn't have, which makes absolutely no sense. I mean, how many tribes were great war powers. I mean, they were, of course they exercised justice, had justice systems over non-Indians. But so that began a long, that was unfortunate for, it's just living with that. Some of these Supreme Court cases, some good, many of them, the effects we live with today. So this is just basically the history I went over. Here's the 6 months, 500 fine, 1 year. Oliphant. And then we went over some of these statistics. So we know that nearly 4 in 5 victims of rape, sexual assault, are the offender is non-Indian. And so the Violence Against Women Act gives tribes jurisdiction to prosecute non-Indians who commit crimes where there's a relationship between the two individuals. So it's intimate partner, and it could be spouse, intimate partner, dating, but it doesn't cover sexual assault in most of those cases where there is no relationship between the victim and the offender. So VAWA doesn't apply, it doesn't cover that. So it's a huge, obviously, gap. So I mean, it does cover sexual assault if there's a relationship. If you're dating someone, you're sexually assaulted, VAWA applies. But if it's a stranger rape, VAWA doesn't apply. Right prior to VAWA, they passed the Tribal Law and Order Act, and that was 2010. And what this did was increase the ability of tribes to prosecute. This is not over non-Indians. I mean, this limitation applies to a tribe's own tribal members. So they increased it to imprisonment 3 years, and then you can stack sentences up to a total of 9 years. So that's pretty significant. I mean, that's the first time where you could provide some justice, provide some sense of security to a victim that the offender is going to be in jail for at least 9 years. So that was in 2010, significant change. You had a question back here? That was challenged, and that was the Durrell fixed. That was fixed legislatively. So yes, so that was a gap at one point, but it was fixed. So yeah, at one point the tribe couldn't exercise jurisdiction over a tribal member from another tribe, in addition to non-Indians, but that was fixed. So thanks for mentioning that. So and again, you know, these are mixed sort of in order to get back, I mean, to reclaim sovereignty. It's not really truly returning tribes to their sovereign state, because every time that tribes regain some sovereignty, it comes at a cost. That cost is that basically tribes have to adopt Anglo systems of criminal justice. And that's where, and it makes it very costly at times. You know, we can say that traditionally tribes do not deny individuals due process. They do not, they allow individuals to be heard. There is a system of justice that is long predates the Anglo system of justice. But this is what we have licensed, trained judges providing counsel. So now, in most tribal courts today, the judges and the attorneys, they're all law trained. You have the Department of Justice, the federal, the funds that grants here, they provide a lot of funds to train judges and to develop tribal criminal codes, to help with implementing a jury system. And so that's something that's been ongoing since probably like 2010. So here's where I was speaking about where there has to be some relationship. So there has to be some tie. So there is a gap, again, because it doesn't cover violence by a stranger, by a non-Indian. And when we think about gender-based violence, the lawlessness that occurred beginning from the well, probably from Oliphant, from the 70s, we think that we try to figure out what, like, the social economic factors that occurring on tribal reservations to cause increase in violence. But really, when you think about it, predators are sophisticated individuals, and you can't. I believe that they learn about this, they know about this. Indian women are easy targets. You will not get prosecuted. And we know this, that from the story I read in the beginning, how an abuser can quickly realize that he's not going to be incarcerated for committing violence. So here, the Anglo system. So the habeas corpus review is that the offender can challenge if there's some irregularity in the proceedings, if they're not following VAWA. So there are 22 tribes now since 2018, the last time that they took a survey. 22 tribes out of 573 that are exercising enhanced jurisdiction, VAWA jurisdiction. And that's a big result of the federal government providing funding, some early pilot projects. And so I can tell you that our firm works with tribes in Minnesota to implement VAWA. And I can give you an example of one tribe. I won't name the tribe, but the Department of Justice spends about $250,000 just to get the codes in place, to get the judges, the bench book, the jury instructions, the community training, the training the prosecutors and the public defenders, and so because of all the requirements that have to be met, when a non-Indian is tried, they have to be tried by their peers. So you have to go out and somehow have a system of getting non-Indians on your jury. So it is a very so it's 2013 when VAWA was first enacted. So we've got 6 years, and at that rate, how many years is that going to take to get that done? And so the people are looking for alternatives, and the alternatives are promising. Here's the statistics there about. This is 2018. On 573 tribes, 573 nations, Alaska included. So the promising alternatives are, one is cross-deputization. So we know that most reservations are not intact. They've been diminished or disestablished. They're checkerboarded. So it's, in most cases, when they're responding to a crime, a sexual assault or domestic violence, they initially don't know who has jurisdiction. And so they could show up there knowing if the tribal police are familiar with that area. They may or may not know they have jurisdiction, and they proceed accordingly. The state may come in, and so again, it's not a good way to be I can imagine how frustrating that would be as a first responder. So cross-deputization means that tribes, tribal police, state police, they agree to exercise jurisdiction across their jurisdictions, exercise jurisdictions that they normally would not have but for the agreement. So a tribe can agree that it's going to enforce state law on tribal land so that it has the ability then to arrest. They would turn them over probably to, a state incarceration, but it also may give them the ability to investigate the crime committed by that non-Indian, and that would allow them to have resources. And so, and then, depending on the locations, that could give the state jurisdiction to enforce state law on tribal reservations. So it just depends on the tribe's needs, but it's something that doesn't require VAWA. It's not dependent on VAWA, and it's been very successful. There's the tribes in Michigan have cross-deputization agreements that are very, very effective. The other way to do it is to have an agreement or a mechanism for state tribal attorney generals to become state deputy attorney generals. And that means that they can go into state court and prosecute a crime. And they could, investigate and prosecute in state court. Deputization. Mm-hmm. Well, there would be, they all have, the feds and the tribe have jurisdiction, and the state may or may not. But there could be some exercise of state jurisdiction under a cross-deputization agreement, so that they can respond to a crime that's occurring on tribal lands, and so that there will be a responder. So it's a state law enforcement mechanism, right? So then we can get to the prosecution level, which can be state or federal. So under the state, like in South Dakota, the Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota allows, has given authority to tribal attorney generals to be state deputy attorney generals, and they can go into state court and prosecute offenses committed by non-Indians against their tribal members. And under the federal, there is a program now where it is the United States attorneys. So a tribal prosecutor can participate in a program where they get trained by the federal prosecutors, and so then they can go into federal court and prosecute crimes. So that to me is amazing. I mean because really you could have, the laws give jurisdiction, but if you look at $250,000 to implement VAWA in a tribal justice system, that may take 2 to 3 years, versus getting cross-deputization, getting your tribal prosecutors to be able to go into state court or federal court to prosecute crimes. I think those are very promising. There's no parity or reciprocity in Indian country, but you would think that they would be able to argue that. Yes, I mean, yeah, but there isn't a I haven't seen a state statute or a jury. No, yeah, but that would be I'm sure they're arguing it. Yeah. I think part of it is it's not timely, and it's also very difficult to investigate, as some of you may know. Have worked with crime victims. Usually the victim has to participate some degree, providing impact statement. Now tribes can you can make that process much easier. You could have like a social worker sit down and help them fill it out, or fill it out for them based on their what they tell you. But just investigating the resources to do that is not easy. And we, know small communities where people are not willing to talk. So I would imagine like some of those, they probably did spend probably 6 to 12 months in jail, awaiting that dismissal though. And I'm gonna be cognizant of the time. So let me move to a little community sort of response. So the family victim services, tribes, we do a lot of work with doing assessments of tribal courts and social service agencies to see areas where they're needing some sort of, where there's some deficiencies or just to make some recommendations. But it always comes down to trying to work within a system that does not put so many barriers in the way, does not allow tribes to develop tribal models based on traditional values, community responses that are and a lot of that, as you can see, it's the manner how our tribes are able to exercise criminal jurisdiction within an Anglo justice system. Doesn't leave a lot of room for cultural traditions, and so the social services. How many different funding mechanisms do you have? I mean, it is, you have Title IV, you have state, sometimes tribes administer county funds, so you have all these funding mechanisms that have imposed all these different practice requirements, different ways of that you deal with child maltreatment, and so once you become experts at compliance, and you become administrators, and very little time to actually, be out in the field, working with families, attending community events, organizing community events. I don't know any way around that. It's other than to get really good at it and use technology aids, and that's just part of it. Just like as an attorney, I have to bill. Every minute my life is accounted for as a tenth of an hour. And so, but you find a system. I have a handheld app that times me, and I have all the clients in there, and so then I can do what I like to do, which is work with tribal clients. So the accountability in the community traditionally, it is. I have been sober for 30 years. I got sober in Minneapolis down on Franklin Avenue, which has been revitalized completely. Back then it was just some bars and it was, and so I got it in the 80s. And really coming to that point, I don't know. I drank myself sober one day. I'd fallen down the stairs and I had like $6 or $7 in my pocket. I had 2 black eyes. I just had a cast removed. I had no shoes, and I had these lime-colored socks, and my clothes didn't fit right. And it was like, normally, my liver was not functioning right, so I would just get like a 3-2 at the SA, and be out at night maybe. And I was saying, okay, I have $6 in my pocket. I have to go. It's daylight now. I had some stitches. I have to go find a drink, and nobody's going to sell to me looking like I do. And so I said, and I just like, I can't do this anymore. And my brother always told me, he said, one's not enough, and one's too many, and 1,000's not enough. But I think I got to that point where it was enough. And it was the green socks. It was like, and looking at myself in the mirror. And so I said, and so it was Saturday early morning, and it was like at Hennepin County in the emergency room, and I said, I want to go to detox. And they said, okay, well, we'll get you transported there. And it's waiting hours, and finally I said, well, I have money. It's only like, I don't know how many blocks. I'll get a cab. So I got a cab. I went to 1800 Chicago detox, and they were laughing at me because I took a cab there. I mean, what drunk takes a cab to the detox? And so I get up there, and and they do the breath analyzer right when you first get in there. So I was a 0.36. And I had never felt more sober in the last 2 years. It was like I was unconscious for 2 years and I woke up and I've been sober ever since. And so, thank you. And during that time, you know, it is traditional treatment, halfway house, being integrated and reconciled with my family and my son. And the other part was later on in life was learning mindfulness. And that really made me a much happier person, much more likable, not the dry drunk. And that's something I teach my grandchildren. And that has really saved my life and kept me sober all that time. So, and I want to talk to you about, just briefly, I'll wrap up here, is my vision. So when I was, one of the treatment centers I went to, it wasn't a treatment center. I was 18 years old. It was in the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico. It was called Delancey Street Foundation. And I stayed there for 6, 7, 8 months. There weren't any other Indian people there. They said they'd had a few, but nobody ever stayed. It was a place, it didn't work for me. It was too removed from my family, community, and there was no spirituality at all. But they had a model that has stuck with me since then, and that we're working on recreating in the Twin Cities. And that is a place where they took people, it was a diversion program. They took people from prison. They could not have had a violent offense, murder, rape. You went in there were no professionals. It was people that started from day one, had been there maybe 10, the average stay was 7 to 10 years. And you get there the first 3 months and you work. A beautiful place in the Jemez Mountains that was donated, was a ranch. And you're given clothes. The food is amazing, and the surroundings are amazing. First 3 months you're followed around. You're not left alone. If you're going to use the bathroom, somebody stands outside. And you work 8 to 5, have a little recreation, and then you go to what's called the game for 3 to 5 hours, 3 times a week. And in that place, there is no history of violence. You have men and women, most of them coming directly from prison, and there is no violence. Because there is this sense of community, a sense of that this is your last chance, and there's a sense of like, you've never had it better, your surroundings, and that there's a sense of like attaining a certain status. You see people that have been there 10 years and how comfortable they are. Some of them have gone, you know, to get college degrees. Some of them are running trucking companies. Some of them are running construction crews. Some are artists. And you see that, and they say, that can be you. And so you start out, and if you don't follow the rules, you go back to day one every time. Doesn't matter if you've been there 10 years, you go back to day one. That is an incentive. And so the game is, you just sit around and there's no confrontations on the floor. And so you go to the game to vent and to really break down people, and anything goes. Sit in your chair though. And you know, if you have a disagreement with someone today, you can put their name in a box and say, I want to be in the same room as them. It's like about 8 to 10 people in a room. So that's the whole program. That's it. There's no professional staff. So you can't be on medication when there. You have to be somewhat able-bodied. So you deal with all the mental health issues, the treatment, the detox, before you get there. The thing they did is that it is like a community, so anything you own, you walk in the door, it no longer belongs to you. You turn it over to the foundation. Most people don't have anything, but when you get there, they own businesses. So they own a trucking company. They are caterers. In New Mexico, they are the only ex-cons that have a liquor license so that they can cater weddings. In the San Francisco, they have one where they own bed and breakfasts in the hills. In New York, they own a castle. And it is a place where you will learn a trade. You will go to school, and you will work, and you don't ever make any money, but you get a place that is free of violence, a place where there is no drugs or alcohol, and where you are valued, your contributions are valued, and that is something I think that could be created for Indian people, but there would be a spiritual component to it, and there would be contact with family. There has to be, and with tribal community. But it would be a place that would address, we talk about the need for housing, for medical care, for economic development, for entrepreneurship, and that all is encompassed within that model. And so that is my my vision and something that I work on in my spare time. So so I thank you for listening, and I'd take any questions if anybody has any. Yeah. Mhm. So the peacemaking is interesting. I mean, the Navajo model is the most, the most bit long-standing and documented, and so that begins, and I think that works well for. I don't think it works that well for sexual violence, but it can. But it's basically how I learned or seen it is that it's like a stages, and really it is about the incentive is why it works is that you have to have had some tie to your community, and you have to. The incentive is you're fearful of losing that, being ostracized, and you've probably already been ostracized by your family and your spouse or your partner. And so that is to me, I see that as a process of bringing that person back in. It is not a process where there is people aren't judged guilty. They're not. It is a process of reconciliation at times, or just healing. And so I think it works well, and for many different keeping people from getting to that point where they commit violent crimes. But I also think it works for violent crimes if it's done carefully. And so the other one is the diversion programs where you have like elders, and they're getting young offenders, spending time with elders, and then learning from them. I think SAMHSA does some good, has some good guidance on that, and their guidance is that idleness will lead someone back to using, and so you really need structure. And I think the mindfulness work, the DBT type, is being used a lot in treatment centers, but that sort of getting to work right away, I think, is really important. And some people may have difficulty at night. Maybe they need a night job. But you throw when you first get sober, you throw yourself into a structure, and you want to have somebody that you check in with, and then you want to have, so you get up at the same time every day. You go to work, you go to a meeting, and you go to lots of meetings, or whatever support spiritual advisor you have, that whatever program you're working. But I think that idleness is that will get somebody every time. Well, I think that you can try that, but it becomes political sometimes because it's if the other partner wants them there, and then but at the same time, if the individual wants help, usually nowadays it's done through an order of protection, so that can be prosecuted if a non-Indian, if there's an order of protection and that's violated, that can be prosecuted as an offense. So it's interesting because the banishment, like for non-Indian excluding, yes, they're supposed to have the power to exclude, and they should, but I think oftentimes it becomes political. But I was I was thinking about like traditional banning or shunning, or I think that's more of something that just automatically happens when somebody commits a crime, a violent crime, or there is this people, and once the offender is separated from the victims, it's not likely that person's going to be successful unless there's some way to bring them back into the community as being, but rehabilitation or through peacemaking or through some diversion program, so I think that is an important like traditional concept to keep, and it just kind of is implemented in different ways. Mhm. No, it's usually not used on non-Indians. I mean, yeah, it doesn't, it makes no sense really to do it on a non-Indian to bring that person back in. So generally they use whatever, try to reach the victim to provide support and the ability for that individual to pursue justice. And then once, there's that little, just the willingness, then, many of you will be there to help that person through the process. Oh, sorry, I can probably bring this over there. Yeah, he was talking about banishment of non-Indians, but yeah, it doesn't really as a cultural thing, that we wouldn't do that with non-Indians. It doesn't really make much sense. Mhm. Right. If I don't know, maybe you saw the encampment in Minnesota on Franklin Avenue. Many of the tribal people that were no longer going to homeless shelters had been banished from those homeless shelters because they had violated rules, and some are like lifetime restrictions. And they also didn't permit families to stay together, and so many of them are addicted to opioids. Well, there was a lot of sexual violence that went on in that encampment, and there were men that were in positions of power that were engaged in those activities. And so what women did was to have a march to say that and they had basically their own Me Too movement. And it was Indian women who themselves had been victims or who saw this and trying to do something about that. And that's basically it, sort of the dynamic there for power and violence and control. And it is, so in that case, it was, taking individuals to stand up and say that together that they had a voice, and there was opposition to it, and from other women too. That's not it's going to bring a negative light to the encampment or our community, and we don't want that exposed. We should deal with it through traditional, and we should pull these men aside and provide them counseling and traditional help. And at that point, how is that going to happen? But, so starting just with protest and with I think that sort of organizing also has to become part of our the way we operate in Indian country or in tribal community or urban communities where most of us live. Yeah, I mean, I would say in theory that all can happen and that could happen. But I mean, that can happen in theory. But in practice, I don't know that that would happen because then the non-Indian is not likely to continue to affirm his tribal members or her tribal membership throughout the prosecution. So does that make sense? So if you're saying you're going to make that non-Indian a member of the tribe so that the tribe then can make that tribal member, that non-Indian tribal member accountable and prosecute them, they would probably, the first thing they would do is disavow their membership upon being charged. And there would be nothing, the courts would still see them as a non-Indian. But maybe that would hold up, that once you become a tribal member, you can't relinquish it. Yeah, then in theory, I'd say that could work. I haven't heard of a test case, but yeah. Yeah. I'll let some of the younger attorneys in our office handle that. No, Miigwech.
So I see our folks from our catering out in the hallway. We do have lunch, as I mentioned yesterday. If you were here yesterday afternoon, a significant portion of the ingredients utilized and recipes are from our Decolonizing Diet project, of which we do have cookbooks here, and they. If you're interested in seeing some of those, I have been asked if the bread recipe is in the cookbook, and it is. I can't remember what page. I think it's like 10 or 12. But as is customary, I would say and invite within our communities, elders go first. I normally don't call anybody out. You self-identify as an elder. So I would invite you to go help yourself to some lunch, stretch your